In the barren canyons of Arizona, 1935, where the wind carves whispers through red stone, a team of gold prospectors vanished without a trace. Locals spoke of strange sounds, voices that rose and fell with the dusk wind, echoing words no one could understand. Some said it was the canyon calling them home. Others swore they heard the miners screaming back. What began as a search for gold became a descent into something far darker, a legend of voices that never stopped, even when every living soul had disappeared. The year was 1935, and the deserts of northern Arizona shimmered under a cruel sun that baked the canyons into silence. The Great Depression had driven men to desperation, farmers, drifters, veterans, each chasing one last promise of fortune buried beneath the unforgiving red stone. Gold fever ran deep in those years, not as a dream but as a necessity. The newspapers printed stories of men striking veins in hidden gulches, and whispers spread through the saloons of Flagstaff and Holbrook about a place known only in rumor as the Devil's Spine. It was said that those who entered came back rich or not at all. Among the restless seekers were 5, men who believed fate had saved its final reward for them. Samuel Haynes, the eldest, was a former railroad engineer turned prospector who carried his maps like scripture. The Morrow brothers, Walt and Earl, were rough, heavy-shouldered men known for drinking and fighting in equal measure. Jack Delaney was the youngest, a talkative gambler who had lost everything but his shovel and his charm. And then there was Ford, the quiet stranger no one knew much about. Some said he'd worked the mines in Nevada. Others whispered he'd left a wife and a tragedy behind. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. They rode out from Flagstaff with 3 mules, 30 gallons of water and a borrowed radio, an odd choice for prospectors. Haynes claimed he used it to check in with the supply man back east, but Delaney joked that he just liked hearing another voice in that vast emptiness. The group made camp deep within the canyon, beneath walls that glowed blood-red at sunset and swallowed every echo. The men said it felt as if sound died in there, like the canyon didn't want to give anything back. By the second week, they struck what looked like a promising seam near the base of a limestone wall. Spirits rose. They worked late into the nights, the clinking of metal against rock echoing like hollow bells. But strange things began happening soon after. One night, Ford claimed to hear a voice humming, soft at first, then rising into something that almost formed words. The others laughed it off, saying it was the wind curling through the stone corridors. Yet the following morning, the coffee pot was still warm, though the fire had gone out hours earlier, and a single pickaxe was found half buried upright in the sand, as though someone had jammed it there in panic. The radio began to behave oddly around the same time. Static filled the speaker, breaking occasionally with faint tones as though someone were tapping on metal from far away. Haynes tried to adjust the dials, but instead of fading, the noise grew louder. Some nights it sounded like a whispering choir, distant but deliberate, almost rhythmic. Walt Morrow said he heard his own name once. Earl refused to sit near the radio after that. Delaney joked that it was the canyon talking, but even he stopped laughing when their mules began refusing to enter certain paths, snorting and backing away at invisible walls. One evening, as the sun bled out over the cliffs, Ford swore he saw a flicker of blue light move across the canyon floor. It wasn't a lantern or a reflection. It moved too smoothly, almost gliding along the rock. He tried to follow it, but was pulled back by Haynes, who muttered, "Don't chase what calls you." That night, the wind carried whispers again, low, melodic, neither male nor female, words twisted in a language none of them could name. Delaney wrote in his journal that it sounded like prayer. Within a few days, one by one, they stopped keeping journals altogether. Days turned to weeks, and when the men failed to return, concern began to spread among those who knew them. The supply clerk in Flagstaff, who was meant to receive word by radio every 10 days, reported only silence. By the 3rd week, he sent a small scouting party, 2 locals who had once worked the same mining trails, to find them. The path was long and merciless, a winding descent into canyons where shadows stretched like cracks in the earth. When they reached Dead Man's Hollow, the place was eerily still. The men's camp was there, or what was left of it, lying in uncanny disarray, as if time had simply stopped mid-movement. The fire pit was still blackened, ash scattered but uncooled, suggesting someone had been there not long before. A pot hung half-filled with water. 5 bedrolls were laid out neatly beside the embers, each showing the faint imprint of a body. Nothing looked rushed. No torn tents, no overturned pans, no signs of violence. But the ground around the site told another story. There were no footprints leading away, only their original tracks leading in. It was as if the canyon had swallowed them whole without disturbing a grain of sand. One of the searchers found a map nailed to a wooden post beside the camp, marked with a red X deep within the gorge. The ink had bled under the heat, and the edges of the paper were scorched, though there was no sign of fire nearby. A journal lay beside it, belonging to Jack Delaney. The last entry was dated August 14, 1935, written in a hurried, shaky hand. Voices again tonight. Closer now. Walt says they're calling from below the ridge. Ford doesn't sleep anymore. That was the final line. The rest of the page was smudged as though something wet had run across it. Maybe rain, maybe sweat, maybe tears. The sheriff of Coconino County was notified, and an official search began within days. He led 6 men and a guide into the same canyon. They expected to find bodies or evidence of a collapse, but what they found only deepened the unease. Near the edge of a dry riverbed, a shovel stood buried upright in solid ground, driven deep as if by tremendous force. Around it, the soil was charred in a perfect circle 2 feet wide. The sheriff ordered photographs, but the camera jammed twice, the film coming out completely black. By dusk, the wind began to rise, carrying with it a low hum that none of them could quite place. It wasn't like the whistle of air through rock. It was softer, layered, and it seemed to move, shifting from one wall of the canyon to the other. One deputy called out, thinking someone was shouting from afar, but no voice answered. Just that strange hum, fading, then rising again. The guide, an old Navajo tracker, told them not to speak after dark. "The canyon remembers words," he said quietly, refusing to explain further. The next morning, they found the remnants of a second fire farther up the ridge. Around it lay scattered tools, picks, brushes, a radio in pieces. Its wiring was twisted as though melted, though there had been no visible heat source. The sheriff collected the fragments, wrapping them carefully. But that night back at camp, several men woke to hear faint tapping from the equipment box. 3 knocks paused, then 3 again. When they opened it, nothing moved. The guide crossed himself and whispered a prayer in his native tongue. They left the canyon by midday, shaken and silent. The official report would later claim, disappearance under unknown conditions. But every man who went in that week came out changed, hollow-eyed and restless. Some swore they could still hear the voices days later when the wind was right, faint, pleading, like echoes buried just beneath the sound of their own breath. The investigation dragged on through the late summer heat, but no trace of the 5 men was ever found. Their mules had vanished, their supplies remained untouched, and the canyon itself seemed to mock every search team that entered it. When the sheriff's men combed the area again, they noticed something new, fires that appeared to relight themselves. Charred rings in the sand glowed faintly even after the embers were buried. Each time they returned, the fires would burn anew, though no living soul had been seen nearby. The phenomenon unsettled even the most hardened of them. They began to call it the canyon's breath. One of the deputies, Frank Delson, claimed that on the second night of the search, he saw figures moving across the canyon rim, 5 of them, carrying dim lanterns. He shouted out, believing it was the missing prospectors, but the figures did not respond. They only stood still, the faint light from their lamps flickering like distant stars. When he blinked, they were gone. The men climbed the ridge to investigate, but they found nothing. No prints, no lanterns, no sign that anyone had ever stood there. The rock was bare, cold to the touch, though the air was still and heavy with the smell of burnt metal. The sheriff, already wary of local folklore, began keeping his findings quiet. He didn't want panic spreading through nearby towns or gold seekers flooding in to chase stories of curses. Still, word leaked. Ranchers and miners began sharing their own accounts, stories of strange lights that appeared in the canyon after sundown, of faint voices rising from the depths, echoing through the walls. One man claimed he heard someone call his name from far below the cliffside, but when he looked, the canyon was empty. Another reported seeing smoke without fire, a thin blue mist twisting through the ravine, forming what looked like human shapes before dissolving into air. By September, locals refused to travel through Dead Man's Hollow after dark. Travelers passing through reported losing their sense of direction, compasses spinning aimlessly, lanterns flickering out for no reason. Some claimed the air grew unnaturally cold the deeper they went, even in daylight. One prospector, who had ventured close to the site out of curiosity, described a sudden stillness so absolute that it felt like time itself had stopped. "The wind died," he said later, "and then I heard breathing. Not mine, not human. The canyon seemed to feed on silence. Even the birds that once circled above were gone. Coyotes stopped howling. The only sound that remained was a faint hum, a low vibration that came and went like a heartbeat in stone." Scientists from the university in Tucson visited briefly, suggesting it could be a geological effect caused by shifting temperatures and mineral composition in the walls. They set up instruments to measure the sound but packed up within 2 nights, claiming their equipment was malfunctioning. Their notes were later found scattered across the camp, most of them blank, save for one cryptic line scribbled in the margin. "It sounds like words when you're alone." In the months that followed, hikers stumbled upon remnants of the lost camp, but what they found made even less sense. A tin cup half buried in sand, perfectly upright. A pickaxe embedded in rock as if fused there by heat. A scrap of fabric bleached white and crusted with something that looked like salt but wasn't. Every item felt preserved, untouched by decay, as though time had stopped when the men disappeared. Those who dared to linger long enough swore they heard faint singing from the canyon floor, the melody distant yet deliberate, as if performed by voices buried under centuries of stone. The sheriff finally sealed the area off, calling it a danger zone due to unstable ground, but everyone knew it was something else. They said the canyon was no longer just a place, it had become a grave, not of bodies but of sound, holding the last echoes of men who had vanished into its depths, leaving behind only the whispers of what once was. Rumors spread through the border towns like wildfire, each retelling warping the truth further from what little the sheriff's men had seen. The disappearances of the 5 prospectors became the heart of countless theories, from the rational to the terrifying. Some insisted it was a gang of outlaws who had ambushed them for supplies and buried the bodies deep within the canyon. Others blamed rival prospectors or smugglers who wanted to scare people away from the gold-rich veins rumored to run beneath Deadman's Hollow. But none of those explanations accounted for the details that no one could ignore. Fires that burned without fuel, voices that carried without wind, and the eerie way the canyon seemed to hum long after nightfall. By late 1935, investigators began to arrive from outside Arizona, drawn by the growing notoriety of what newspapers were calling the canyon's curse. Among them was a geologist named Dr. Leonard Price from the University of New Mexico. He believed the sounds were caused by trapped air pockets inside the rock, a rare phenomenon that created harmonic vibrations. He brought instruments to test his theory, setting up camp exactly where the prospectors' tents had been found. For 2 nights, his team reported nothing but the dry whisper of wind. On the 3rd night, the vibrations began, deep, pulsing tones that echoed from below the canyon floor. One assistant described it as a moan made by the earth itself. Another noted that the readings on their devices spiked sharply each time someone spoke aloud, as if the canyon were responding. Then the instruments failed. Metal warped, glass cracked, and when they tried to record the sound, the tape hissed with static, then went blank. The team abandoned their camp by dawn. Dr. Price's final note in his logbook read, "There are frequencies here beyond our perception. They don't travel through air. They travel through us." He refused to ever return, later describing the place as a cavity of grief carved into the desert. Yet others offered stranger explanations. Spiritualists claimed the canyon was a thin place, a location where the veil between the living and the dead grew weak. They said the miners had disturbed an ancient burial ground and that the whispers were the dead reclaiming what had been stolen. A Navajo elder named Asa Redbird told reporters that the canyon was once sacred, a passage where souls waited before crossing to the next world. They were not supposed to dig, he said quietly. When they struck the stone, they struck the waiting ones. His words were largely dismissed by authorities, but locals took them to heart. The few who still passed near the canyon left small offerings, tobacco, coins, or bread, to appease whatever lingered there. Meanwhile, skeptics clung to science. Some proposed that strange lights and sounds were caused by seismic stress or magnetic minerals in the rock, interfering with the air, but their theories crumbled under one detail: the voices. Dozens of witnesses, from search teams to travelers, had reported hearing distinct words, sometimes their own names. No rock could mimic that, no echo could speak back. As more people shared their accounts, the stories grew darker. Ranchers described seeing outlines of men walking across the ridges at twilight, their forms transparent, their steps silent. Others heard laughter carried on the wind, soft and mocking. By winter, Deadman's Hollow had become a forbidden place, avoided even by those who once mined nearby. Maps stopped marking its trails. The sheriff stopped answering questions. The canyon returned to silence, but that silence was not peace. It was a waiting kind, the heavy pause between one breath and another. The theories continued to multiply, earthly, spiritual, and otherworldly, but none brought comfort. The canyon remained vast and indifferent, holding its secret like a wound that refused to close. By early 1936, the mystery of Deadman's Hollow had begun to rot beneath its own legend. Fear spread faster than reason, and every news story added another layer of dread. Locals spoke of lantern lights seen deep within the canyon, even though no one dared enter after dusk. The sheriff's department had long abandoned its search, but a few men still ventured there in secret, either driven by greed for the rumored gold veins or by the stubborn desire to prove that the canyon's curse was nothing more than superstition. Among them was a prospector named William Harlow, a quiet man from Flagstaff who didn't believe in ghosts or curses, only an opportunity. Harlow arrived in the spring, armed with nothing but a pickaxe, his mule, and a small radio transmitter he used to report back to a friend in Winslow. The plan was simple: spend 1 week surveying the canyon's floor for mineral traces, then return before the heat became unbearable. On his second night, Harlow set up camp near the same rock ledge where Dr. Price's team had abandoned their equipment months before. He noted in his field journal that the canyon was eerily still, the kind of quiet that makes your heartbeat sound too loud. He also mentioned hearing faint tapping sounds from below the ground, rhythmic and deliberate like metal against stone. He assumed it was the echo of his own movements until the tapping continued long after he stopped working. That night, he tried to contact his friend through the radio. At first, the transmission worked fine, short bursts of static followed by a faint voice from Winslow. But then the line began to distort. Harlow's voice faded, replaced by a low, garbled hum that seemed to come from nowhere. His friend, listening from nearly 50 miles away, later told reporters that the static turned into something resembling whispering, a chorus of indistinct voices murmuring words he couldn't understand. The sound grew louder until it overwhelmed the signal completely. Then silence. Harlow's friend assumed the battery had died. It wasn't until days later that he realized something had gone terribly wrong. A rescue team was sent after Harlow when he failed to return. They found his mule dead near the canyon's rim, its reins torn as if it had tried to flee. The campsite was still intact, tent standing, supplies untouched, but there was no sign of Harlow himself. Only his radio remained, half buried in the dirt, its dial still glowing faintly. The rescue team brought it back to town, where a technician attempted to replay the last recorded broadcast. What they heard chilled them to the bone. Faint breathing, a whisper repeating a single phrase over and over. "It's beneath you. It's beneath you," followed by a scream that cut off abruptly. The tape snapped moments later, as if something inside the machine had burned out. Word of the recording spread quickly. Newspapers sensationalized the event, calling it proof that the canyon was alive. Skeptics accused the press of fabricating evidence, but those who heard the tape firsthand insisted it was real. Even the technician who handled the machine refused to work on it again, claiming that after replaying the sound, his house filled with a persistent hum that no one else could hear. He described it as a frequency of despair, something that crawled into the mind and stayed there. Over the next few weeks, people began reporting strange phenomena near the canyon. Compass needles spun wildly, birds refused to fly overhead, and travelers swore they saw shapes moving in the heat haze, pale figures watching from the cliffs. One man, a rancher passing through, claimed he found footprints leading straight into a wall of stone, as though someone had walked directly into it and vanished. Sheriff Dalton ordered the entire area sealed off, citing safety hazards. But the damage to the town's sanity had already been done. Families moved away, churches filled with people desperate for protection, The canyon was no longer just a place, it was an idea, an infection of fear that seeped into the minds of everyone who spoke its name. And through it all, the wind carried a new sound, something distant, hollow and rhythmic. To some it was the echo of tools striking gold. To others it was the canyon itself, whispering to anyone foolish enough to listen. By the time the 1950s arrived, Dead Man's Hollow had slipped from the headlines and settled into folklore. A ghost story passed between truckers and travelers cutting through the desolate Arizona plains. But for the families of those who vanished, the canyon was more than a rumor. It was a wound that refused to close, and though official searches had long been discontinued, the legend kept luring people back. Curiosity seekers, amateur scientists, spiritualists, they all came with theories and devices determined to solve the riddle of the canyon's eerie signals. None stayed for long. Most left shaken, their equipment fried, their recordings inexplicably distorted by the same static-laced whispers that haunted the 1935 transmissions. In 1956, a small group of geology students from Tucson University ventured to the site, equipped with modern instruments, seismic detectors, early tape recorders, and radio amplifiers. Their goal was to test whether underground vibrations or magnetic anomalies might explain the sounds reported decades earlier. For the first 2 days, everything went as planned. They recorded harmless static, faint echoes, and the natural hum of the wind tunneling through the canyon walls. But on the third night, their data spiked, violent, irregular pulses that defied explanation. The signals resembled no geological activity. Instead, the patterns mimicked human breathing. Deep inhales, shallow exhales, and something faintly like words trying to form between them. At 2:17 a.m., one of the students, a young woman named Evelyn Monroe, noted in her journal that she could hear the signal with her ears now, not just the instruments. She described it as a low calling sound rising and falling, like someone whispering from beneath the earth. The group decided to leave by morning, but when dawn came, they found that one of their members, Peter Lyle, had vanished from his tent. There were no footprints, no drag marks, just the faint outline of his sleeping bag pressed into the dirt as if he had been lifted away. His tape recorder was found beside the campfire, still running. The tape contained hours of silence, then faintly Evelyn's voice asking, "Peter, are you awake?" Followed by the unmistakable sound of distant laughter echoing through the canyon. When the survivors returned to Tucson, their recordings were analyzed by an audio engineer. He confirmed that the laughter was real, not mechanical interference or playback distortion. It was human. Multiple voices overlapping at unnatural frequencies. After the incident, Evelyn withdrew from her studies. In her later interviews, she said she dreamed of faces pressed against stone walls, whispering her name through cracks in the rock. They weren't dead, she told a reporter years later. They were waiting. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, rumors of government involvement began to circulate. Locals claimed to have seen black trucks arriving near the canyon late at night, men in suits carrying crates of equipment into the ravine. The official explanation was geological survey work, but no reports were ever published. Some believed the military had discovered a rare mineral capable of interfering with radio frequencies. Others whispered that what they found wasn't mineral at all, that beneath the canyon's surface, something alive was pulsing, breathing, perhaps communicating in ways no human could understand. Even in the modern era, hikers and drone explorers have tried to capture evidence of the canyon's phenomena. Footage often shows sudden bursts of static, blinding white flashes or inexplicable shadows moving against the canyon walls despite no visible source of light. In one particularly unsettling case from 2011, a drone's camera picked up what appeared to be a human figure standing on a ledge, completely motionless, featureless, and pale. The drone lost signal seconds later and crashed. When recovered, its internal memory showed that the final frame of the recording had changed. The figure was gone, replaced by a pitch-black screen, and faintly under the static, a whisper was heard, "Not lost, still here." The canyon today remains officially closed to the public, fenced off and marked as unstable terrain. But at night, if you stand at the outer rim and the wind is right, locals say you can still hear the same pulse that haunted those prospectors in 1935. A rhythm that almost sounds like a heartbeat, deep and patient, echoing through the stone. And sometimes just before dawn, a thin radio signal breaks through the silence, brief, broken, and desperate, calling out from somewhere far below, as though someone trapped in the dark is still trying to make contact. The legend of Deadman's Hollow has endured for nearly a century, etched into Arizona's folklore like a scar that refuses to fade. For locals, it's a cautionary tale whispered around campfires. But for historians, scientists, and storytellers, it remains a riddle that defies time. In 2018, a team of independent researchers decided to revisit the canyon using modern equipment: thermal drones, ground-penetrating radar, and electromagnetic scanners, hoping to find something tangible that could finally separate fact from myth. Their leader, Dr. Allison Green, was a geophysicist who had grown up hearing stories about the lost prospectors and the whispers in the rock. She believed there had to be a rational explanation hidden beneath the layers of superstition. For the first few days, the team detected nothing extraordinary. Their instruments recorded minor magnetic fluctuations, the kind expected in mineral-rich areas. But on the fifth night, as they camped near the old excavation ledge, the same area where Harlow and others had disappeared, unusual readings began to spike across every sensor simultaneously. The electromagnetic field surged to levels far beyond normal, distorting nearby compasses and scrambling their drone controls. Even their digital recorders began capturing fragments of low-frequency murmurs, faint and layered, almost like multiple voices speaking at once. The recordings weren't clear, but the cadence felt deliberate, rhythmic, as if the canyon itself was trying to form words. At 3:04 a.m., one of the thermal drones malfunctioned and descended into a crevice. When the footage was reviewed, it showed something that made even the most skeptical member of the team fall silent. For a brief moment before the crash, the camera captured an image of what appeared to be human shapes embedded in the canyon walls. Silhouettes, not carved or painted, but trapped, as though the rock had swallowed them mid-motion. Some seemed to have open mouths frozen in silent screams. The image lasted less than 2 seconds before the feed went black. The drone was later recovered, its body warped by an intense localized heat despite cool ambient temperatures. The team couldn't explain it, and their instruments offered no data that could make sense of the event. Dr. Green filed a report to the state's Geological Bureau, but officials dismissed the findings as digital corruption and misinterpretation of shadows. Still, the team couldn't shake what they'd seen or heard. Over the following weeks, several members reported hearing faint whispers even after leaving the site. One technician claimed that every time he turned on his shortwave radio, a distorted signal interrupted the frequency, repeating a single word over and over. Below. The word would fade after a few seconds, replaced by the usual static, but it returned each time he tuned in at night. He destroyed the radio after the fifth occurrence, claiming he could still hear the echo in his dreams. Local tribes in the region, particularly the Hopi and Yavapai, were approached for insight into the area's folklore. Elders spoke of spirit voices beneath the red earth, restless presences that could mimic the sounds of men, luring travelers into the deep. According to their stories, the canyon was once a sacred ground where the earth breathed, a place to be respected, not mined. One elder described the whispers as the land remembering what was taken from it. Dr. Green was struck by the similarity between these ancestral warnings and the modern accounts. Perhaps, she theorized, the signals were not external transmissions but natural resonances amplified by underground caverns, creating an auditory illusion. But even she admitted that theory didn't explain the voices recorded when no one was speaking, or the human figures seen in the canyon walls. In the years since, Deadman's Hollow has become a forbidden fascination for paranormal investigators and dark history enthusiasts. Countless online forums host audio clips said to be from the canyon, though most are dismissed as fabrications. Still, one recording circulates among the serious researchers, a crackling, low-frequency signal captured by a ham radio operator in 2020. It's brief, barely 30 seconds long, but within the static, a faint voice can be heard saying, "We found it," but it's not gold. No one knows who the voice belongs to, and no expedition has since returned to verify the claim. Today, Deadman's Hollow remains sealed off, fenced by rusting wire and warning signs that flutter in the desert wind. Yet those who stand at the edge on still nights swear they can hear faint radio static bleeding through the silence, sometimes distant, sometimes startlingly close, as if the canyon hasn't forgotten. And somewhere in the dark, The echoes of those lost voices continue to call out, searching for someone to listen. If the canyon could speak, what would it say? Would it tell us where the lost men of 1935 vanished to? Or why their voices still whisper through the static nearly a century later? Every legend leaves an echo, but some echoes never fade. They just wait for someone brave enough to listen. If this story pulled you into its silence, if it made you wonder what's buried beneath the dust of history, then join us. Subscribe, and step deeper into the forgotten corners of time where truth and terror intertwine. Share your thoughts below. What do you believe happened in the canyon? Were they victims of the land? Or something that was already waiting there long before man ever arrived? Your answers may shape the next mystery we uncover.